This is a Film Stories original podcast. We made this.
Back everyone to the X-Cast. As ever, the truth is in here. I'm your host today, Carl Sweeney, and thank you for joining me for this, which is our episode all about the fourth episode, as broadcast, of the fourth season, which is Unruhe. And I'm joined today by Darren Mooney. How's life treating you, Darren?
Life is good, life is good. How is life treating you? Are you unrestful, Carl? Do you have unrest?
I have no unrest, no trips to the dentist upcoming, nothing like that, so I'm doing good, to be honest.
No interior decorating going on either.
Nothing I can complain about, certainly. So yeah, here we are, Unruhe. Originally aired 27th of October 1996. Long time ago. Where were you in 1996, Darren?
I would have been, at that stage, 8 or 9 years old, and I would have been just back from Ghana. So I would have been in Sligo, in the west of Ireland. I wouldn't have been watching the X-Files live at this point. I think I may have tried around the third season and got scared. Ironically enough, again, every time I say this, I'm still embarrassed by it. Scared by War of the Coprophages of all episodes. Because cockroaches are creepy when they crawl inside your skin. So I was on a bit of a freaked out, my parents wouldn't let me watch it phase at this point. So I didn't get to see it as it aired live. What about yourself?
Well, the 27th of October, 96, was the day after my 10th birthday, as it happens. Oh. And I think at that point I was living in Germany, actually. Oh. My dad was in the British Army and he was stationed in Germany. And we moved around that time, I think probably November or December, back to England. So, yeah, interesting time. I don't think I would have seen this episode until, I guess, 4 or 5 months later was when we got it in the UK. That was typically about the interval.
Can you speak German?
I used to be pretty good at German at school, but it's been so long that I'm just down to a few basic phrases and stuff now, you know. Okay. And I would actually one day like to kind of have a go at kind of picking it up again, but just hasn't happened yet. But one day. Anyhow, this episode, of course, written by Vince Gilligan, directed by Rob Bowman. And this is the episode in which a disturbing photograph left at a crime scene is Mulder and Scully's only clue in an investigation involving a man who kidnaps women and lobotomizes them. Okay, so marks out of 10 is how we typically kick off, isn't it? And yeah, what do you reckon for this one? Unruhe, very interesting episode.
I'd probably go with a solid 8 for this one. I'm a big fan of Unruhe, and I'd argue it's somewhat underrated. Perhaps because the fourth season has so many great episodes, or so many fantastic episodes that great episodes tend to get forgotten or brushed aside. So I'd be a solid, comfortable 8 with this, I think. What about yourself?
I'd also give it an 8. That's what I've got written down. I think it's a very good episode.
The independent adjudicators are just verifying that we had those numbers written down separately.
Well, I thought about it for a while. I was thinking, first of all, because I do really like this one, I was thinking, is 9 too high? And I think I concluded that it was. Because I think it's a very good episode. I don't think it's quite a great one in terms of the all-time greats that the series has to offer. I think what it is another demonstration after Pusher, isn't it, of the effectiveness of pairing together Bowman and Gilligan, I think. It's an episode, I think it blends disparate elements together very well. Though I don't know what you think, Darren, but I think the pace of this one is so rapid that maybe there are some aspects that could have been emphasised further. What do you reckon?
Well, I mean, yeah, it's very much like the combination that you get with Gilligan and Bowman is pure momentum. And I think you look at the work that they've done together. They did, for example, they did Pusher in the third season. They'll do Drive in the sixth season, which really literalizes that. And that Drive is literally pure distilled momentum on a television screen. And I think you're right that Unruhe is probably it's weaker than either of them. Because I think I give both of them a 10. This gets an 8. I think you're right that there's a certain incongruity there in terms of Bowman as a director works very well with sort of action sequences and very well with atmosphere and very well with mood and very well with style. He's a bit less sort of comfortable with out and out horror, I think, than some of the best directors some of the other directors on the show. The thing with Bowman is that he's very propulsive, he's very kinetic, he's very good at framing stuff, and you can tell that he's very good at, like, getting a rhythm of a scene down and getting performances from actors. But if you look at, like, the work that he does, I would argue that, for example, he is one of the issues, with I think he directed Orison in the 7th season, which is an episode where he feels very much out of place as a director, because he never seems really comfortable doing the sort of shots that you have to do in a serial killer story. The kind of leering, voyeuristic, like placing the camera angle in a way that seems inherently creepy, in a way that you need to do if you're doing genre storytelling. He's much more interested in putting the camera where you can get in on the action and get things moving. And I think that maybe is I don't want to say a weakness with Unruhe, because I love Unruhe, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is. But it does mean that I think it doesn't work as well as say, Paper Hearts later in the season, to pick another example, but like as irresistible in the 2nd season, or as like a lot of the similar serial killer narratives that were happening over on Millennium around the same time, because this would have been in the 4th season. I think Unruhe was the first episode of the X-Files to air after the broadcast, the pilot of Millennium. So, I mean, I can understand that. And the other side of that, though, is that, like, while you lose a little bit of that sort of serial killer, sort of voyeuristic approach to making a television episode with Bowman, what you do get is you get a sense of propulsiveness and forward momentum that allows you to skip over what might otherwise be very serious problems with the episode. I mean, like, how exactly does Snows get out of a police station even after shooting a police officer in the head? Like, how poorly guarded is it that he just sneaks out the back door very quietly after discharging a firearm in a station that is presumably filled with police officers who also have firearms? And everyone's like, well, I guess this one got away from us. That sort of stuff. The episode moves fast enough that you don't worry too much about that. And I think that's a credit to Bowman and a credit to Gilligan as well, because there's a lot of stuff in here that if you stop and think about the logic of it, doesn't always kind of fit together perfectly. And I think, like, I talked about this with Tony on Pusher. I don't think it's a huge problem with Pusher, but Pusher has sort of similar logical gaps where it's like, how exactly does Modell's power work that he can write the word FBI on a piece of paper and still somehow push his will onto people if it's not related to his voice? You know, that sort of stuff. And there's a lot more of that in Unruhe, but I don't think it's a huge problem.
No, I don't think it's a huge problem. I think the episode's so propulsive, like you say, there's a sense that you can kind of skip over certain things. But what it also means, I think, is that I'm not sure Scully's experience here, where we're supposed to think she's begun to understand and empathise with Jerry, I don't think it's as impactful as it perhaps could have been, given that they're pairing, they're only paired on screen, I think, for like 5 minutes or something. Even though you got a great guest performance, I think, by Pruitt Taylor Vince. But yeah, the propulsion, I think, like we've mentioned, there's some similarities here with earlier episodes. So Irresistible, the thing with Scully, like I just said, kind of harkens back to something Mulder went through in Grotesque, I suppose. So I think Grotesque is a much better kind of look at that. I think they're minor quibbles. So like I say, an 8, I'm quite a harsh marker overall. I think an 8 is a very, very good outing, to be honest. But I think we've got to have we've got to be rigorous here, haven't we?
Oh yeah, no. I remember when I gave was it Paperclip a 9. And I think Chris Knowles sort of was like, "What the hell do you consider a 10?" and I was like, "Okay, I feel kind of bad if I'm that harsh on it, but I do think it is. I think when you look at like the 4th season as a whole, and I don't want to get too distracted from the episode we're talking about, but this is a season that includes like episodes like Home, for example. Mm-hmm. It contains episodes like Never Again, which is polarizing, but the people who love it really love it. But even stuff like Memento Mori, Paper Hearts, it's got just this it's got all these really great episodes in there. These really phenomenal, like, best in show episodes. If you were giving people like a list of 10 to 20 X-Files episodes to watch, a large portion of them would likely come from this season, and Unruhe probably wouldn't be on that list. But I still think it's a good episode, and I still really like it, and I still think it speaks to a lot of what I like about the X-Files.
Yeah, and it's for that reason that I think it's a wise move that this was the choice to be the first to air on Sundays in the US. So after you kind of mentioned that Millennium had taken over the Fridays at 9 time slot, hadn't it? And yeah, this was produced second but aired 4th. And I think unlike with like Leonard Betts and Memento Mori, the switch doesn't really affect a massive change in terms of the overarching narrative or whatever, or the characters' arcs or anything, but still significant. And yeah, I think this is a tense, unsettling and energetic episode. So it's a good example of what the X-Files can do. So a decent choice to put in front of new audiences, I guess.
It is indeed, and it's a very meat and potatoes episode. It's a very, if you watched it, you would get a sense of everything that the X-Files does. It's scary. It's got this sort of playful dynamic between Mulder and Scully. It can do these stories where the monsters aren't necessarily supernatural. They can be people. It can do serial killer narratives. It's got this huge range of stories that it can tell. And you get a lot of that in Unruhe. It doesn't, Unruhe is a good, all-round X-File. I don't think it does anything that it does exceptionally. I don't think, you can point to one aspect of Unruhe that it does better than any other episode of the show. But it does offer, it kind of scores relatively well across the field, if that makes sense. It embodies a lot of the elements of the X-Files that I would consider to be essential to the show and really love about the show. And while it doesn't do any of them better than any other episode, it does enough of them very well that I'm kind of willing to go with it and that I really, really like it.
Yeah, I would concur. And is there a sense perhaps here that we're seeing the start of Vince Gilligan's breakout year, in the sense that I know he's done Pusher, and obviously some people would argue that that's kind of his crowning glory in terms of the X-Files or whatever. But this is the first year, isn't it, where he does multiple episodes. It's the first year he does a comedy episode. It's the first year he's credited on a mythology episode with, he's one of the 4 writers, I think, on Memento Mori. So he's really becoming a significant player in the series here, isn't he?
He is indeed, and I mean, it's worth noting that Gilligan has that story where he was almost reluctantly kind of courted onto the show. He pitched Soft Light in the 2nd season, and he wrote it, and the show was very eager to accept it. He was offered a staff job. He initially turned it down, and then he showed up, and then he had a huge amount of difficulty actually writing a script. And then he finally managed to get Pusher written, and Pusher was written at the end of the year. And I think Gilligan has sort of talked about this in interviews, and I think it may even be in the Monster of the Week book by Zach Hanlon and by Todd Vanderwerf, where he says that he doesn't know whether it was consciously by design that Carter worked this way, but he noticed that when Carter would take on a young writer with promise, and he speaks specifically of somebody like, say, Darren Morgan, but also himself, what he would do is he would give them a script late in the season, late in their first season, so they would have enough time to write the episode, figure out how the episode works without feeling a crushing deadline on it. And so you have, for example, if you think of Darren Morgan's first proper episode was Humbug, which came late in the 2nd season, and he's talked about how he felt like he couldn't do it, and it was he was up against the wall, and he was, he had the space, and Carter said, look, I didn't touch a line of Humbug, basically. Humbug came in, and he'd worked hard enough on it that it was great. And Gilligan has talked about how he had a great deal of trouble with getting Pusher, and he had to recycle, I think, a premise that he'd planned for a feature film, and handing it to Carter and saying, look, this is the best work that I will ever do. And Carter telling him very frankly, look, that's not what this show is. This is great work, but you're going to constantly be pushing yourself to do better. And Gilligan does that consistently across the run of the X-Files. He's one of those writers where you can actually see him growing and evolving, because, again, he was relatively inexperienced. He'd written a couple of film screenplays before he came on the show, and I think he had a grant from the governor of Virginia as well for screenwriting as well, but he hadn't worked properly in television before joining the show. And what you get to see as he works on the show and as he goes, he develops. And it's interesting because we talk about the mythology and that sort of arc that plays out. Even if you look at, say, Gilligan's standalone scripts, you'll see him working through preoccupations repeatedly in his time on the show. I'm very fond of, for example, the stretch from the 5th season into the 6th season, where you've got stuff like Folie à Deux, for example, and you've also got episodes like Monday, to pick another example. And you've got Drive even. And you have, within these episodes, you can see Gilligan playing with ideas about, capitalism, about society, about work, and about what that means, about that sort of stuff. And he develops them in each of those 3 episodes as they go, and it comes into something of a short thesis statement. And even in the 4th season, which you're right is the first season where he's churning out scripts consistently and reliably, and at a very impressive rate for a television writer, a lot of what you see on Unruhe comes back again in Paper Hearts, a bit more explicitly, I would argue a bit more refined. I think Paper Hearts is a much better episode. But you can see him almost taking a first draft at some of the ideas that he's going to use in Paper Hearts here. And I think it's sort of fascinating to watch a writer develop in that way and almost happen in real time.
Yeah, there was a line here which jumped out at me this time as being kind of quintessentially Gilligan-esque, I suppose, which is when Mulder calls Scully and she's with Jerry. And they've been looking at the photos, and he says something about the guy we're looking for is a very tall man, or he wants to be, And
yeah.
That seems, very much of a piece with Gilligan's characters, ultimately leading up to people like Walter White, of course, on Breaking Bad, but people like Pusher, I suppose.
Well, Pusher is the little man who dreamt that he was big. Like Gilligan's preoccupation with characters, and it's particularly male characters. And again, like we talked a little bit about this on like when I talked about Pusher with Tony. Like Gilligan's fascinated by this idea of toxic masculinity and the idea of like macho performance and the idea of like men who feel the need to be horrible men because that's what men are, or to fulfill the societal role of men. And, you know, you have it in Pusher, where he wants to be like, he advertised an American Ronin as a killer, and he wants to be like this, you know, Moriarty figure to Mulder's sort of Sherlock Holmes. You have it obviously in Dreamland, where, you know, you have the character of Morris Fletcher, who uses this wonderful gift, this wonderful thing where he has his life swap with Mulder, in order to, like, hook up with beautiful women and cheat on his wife. That's the most amazing thing that this man can think to do with this wondrous thing that has happened. Through the stuff like, and you point out Walter White as well, where that stuff is tied into ideas of like masculine pride and even explicitly sexual violence as well. And like, yeah, Gilligan is very much engaged with that. I mean, here in Unruhe, you have this idea of, you know, the little man who literally dreams that he's big in the most sort of literal manner ever when he's put on stilts. And you're right when Mulder points to the photo and says, you know, he's tall or he wants to be. You have this idea of him as a protector, where he's positioning himself as a protector of these women. He's trying to help these women by driving out the howlers, is how he justifies what he does to them, the violence that he commits upon them. He's fulfilling a very masculine, very macho role, and even has that same relationship with his father, you know, where he's trying to reconcile the image that he has with his father with the idea that his father was abusing his sister, by like protecting his sister from the demons that are inside of her. Now, of course, he protects her by driving an ice pick into women that he has chosen to be surrogates for her. And that's a very, very, very warped idea of masculinity. And I think that's something Gilligan gets at repeatedly over the course of his writing for the show and for other shows.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting in this one how they refer to Sigmund Freud a couple of times. But you've got imagery here that kind of cries out for like a Freudian reading, like stilts and an ice pick and whatnot. But we might well come on to that. We're going to go through scene by scene, of course. Just before we do, I mean, we always have a quick check-in at the Internet Movie Database, the IMDb, don't we? So what do you reckon X-Files make of this one over there?
This is hilarious, because despite the fact I host a podcast about the IMDb, I'm uniformly terrible at this. Let's go with a 8.1.
You're 0.2 out, because it gets 8.3. But can you redeem yourself by figuring out how highly this rates when you line up all the Season 4 episodes top to bottom?
I would say it's somewhere in the 10 to 15 range. So I'll go with, say, 13.
14th, not bad. 14th out of 24 this season. And that kind of raises the question for me as to whether this is an underrated episode. I suppose on the evidence of the IMDb, I would say yes, because I think this should be a bit higher. But as we'll come on to at the end of the podcast, we had a lot of appreciation for this one in our mailbag this week. Yay. So what's your sense? I mean, I know you did a poll, it was a while ago, I know, but can you remember if Unruhe figured prominently in the poll you did on the movie blog a year or two back?
Let me just check. I'm actually going to drag up the results here. I should have this.
You mean you don't know this
I
memorized?
don't have it off the top of my head, unfortunately. This is live radio. It's very, very exciting, people. Anything can happen. But I'm searching for Unruhe now at the moment. Unruhe came 54th. It got 18 votes, and none of those were first place votes. It got about 250 points, which means it got a lot of, like, of your top 10, it would have got like 8 or 9. Yeah,
can you see what episode is kind of in and amongst at 54th? What's it kind of near there?
So in terms of, if we're looking at, say, let's do a quick countdown of, like, this is again on the blog, just from 60 to 50. So 60 is the Biogenesis trilogy. 59 is Rain King. 58 is Tempest Fugitive Max, which I would argue is also an underrated episode. 57 is Patient X and The Red and the Black, which I may have words about next year with Tony. 56 is Two Fathers, One Son, which is interesting, because that had a much lower voting frequency and a much higher placement on those votes. This Is Not Happening in Dead Alive are at 55. Unruhe is a 54. Wet Wired is a 53. Tunguska and Terma, interestingly enough, are at 52, which surprised me. 51 is the Hand That Wounds. Okay, I'm not going to try that because I remember when I did that on the Pod Watch. You know the episode I'm talking about. Carl, you speak German, right?
Die Handy Verletzt is what I would say, but don't take me as an authority by any means, please. But, yeah.
And at number 50 is Eve. So that's what it's in among. It's a sort of mix of like mythology episodes that are, I would argue, sort of either underrated or sort of considered to be so-so.
Yeah, I think Tunguska and Terma were above this on IMDb. I think all the mythology episodes this season did pretty well on IMDb, on the IMDb ratings. This is streets ahead of Rain King, I would say. Sorry, Victoria Jackson, if you're listening, but this is much better than Rain King. I would suggest. I don't know, Darren. Should we take a quick? Well, not a quick. Should we take our in-depth scene-by-scene look at this episode?
Let's dive in, Carl.
Okay, so the teaser sequence begins with lots of rain, driving rain. We're outside like a drugstore, a chemist, it seems. A couple pull up. The guy's very nervy, isn't he? You know, so we're on a schedule. So some kind of criminal enterprise in the offing here.
It's very much Psycho. It's very overtly Psycho. It's Gilligan playing with Psycho. It's the idea of, like, this woman who has done something bad at her job, and you find out later that's mail fraud, but it's very clear early on because she's wearing a uniform, while she's also looking for a passport photo, while her boyfriend is like, we need to get the hell out of Dodge. It's very clear that she has done something inappropriate at work that possibly involved coming into money, and they're trying to get away very, very quickly. Again, it's a testament to Gilligan that he can use all these little elements to sort of hint at this stuff, and use, like, the audience's familiarity with genre to understand, you know, maybe not in like fine detail what's happening, but get the basic thrust of who these characters are, where they're coming from, and why they're going somewhere so quickly, very effectively. But it's also, it reminded me a lot on this watch of Psycho, where you have the Janet Leigh character who does something similar. She steals a bunch of money from work, she decides to run away, and then by sheer chance she happens to wander into this like monstrous story involving a serial killer, and it really feels like the characters in the teaser kind of have that experience where they're in a completely different story. They think that their arc is going somewhere very different than where the episode takes them, and while it happens very, very quickly here, I thought that was a really nice touch from Gilligan.
Yeah, and I suppose I wonder how far you can extend the Psycho analogy. I suppose Psycho, of course, has the bathroom, which is a place where you should be safe, but you can be very vulnerable. And maybe that's the same with the dentist chair. You know, it's a place where you should be in good hands, but, you know, a lot of people really do fear going to the dentist, don't they? But we're kind of skipping ahead. But we'll return to the dentist. The
tooth is out there.
I like it. Right, so, yeah, so there's the old guy in the store. A figure in a yellow raincoat enters, who's obviously, we don't know yet, but it's Jerry Schnauz. He shoves her outside, doesn't he? She's drowsy. The boyfriend's dead. We see her POV as the car pulls up and the guy in the yellow coat gets out. And it concludes with the old man looking at the developed photo, and you see kind of the picture of the woman's screaming face, and I think her arm's kind of outstretched, isn't it? So, yeah, pretty attention-grabbing first couple of scenes, I think.
And very, very effective as well. Like, again, we talked about Gilligan. I talked about Gilligan riffing on Psycho there a moment ago. Like, a lot of the stuff in this episode, and again, this maybe speaks to me being a very morbid kid during the 90s, but a lot of, like, even the finer details in this episode speak to, like, Gilligan using the iconography of, like, moral panics and sort of anxieties in the 90s. Like, you'd have those urban legends that would spread online. So the little bit where he walks past, like here where Jerry attacks the first victim that we see, he pricks her with something while he's walking past her that makes her drowsy. He doses her with something, which is very similar to an urban legend that you would hear about, like, certain, like, gang activities and stuff like that. If you go on Snopes, they have, like, a whole section, or at least they used to have a whole section full of these sort of things. Later on, there's a moment where Scully goes to her car to get in, and he's lurking underneath it, and he jabs her with a syringe, which is another story that I recognize from these urban legends that would spread online during the 90s, where allegedly gangs of young men would wait under your car and slash your ankles, slash your Achilles tendons, so that you couldn't run away while they did horrible things to you. And it feels very much like Gilligan's riffing on that. He's very, very good at, like, creating this sort of anxious mood, even without the Vancouver rain, but the Vancouver rain helps almost immediately. It's very, very effective storytelling.
Yeah, I almost regret that the yellow kind of raincoat disappears, because I think that could have been an effective kind of, to kind of set him up as kind of a slasher film villain or something, but it went a different way, of course. And Mulder and Scully then drive into the scene as we pick up after the titles. discussing the case. There's a woman missing. There's no obvious leads. There's this mystery around the photo. And I'll read out the message we had in the mailbag from Marlene at the end, after we've done the scene by scene. But she makes a point in it about Scully's kind of viewpoint in this episode, in that, the episode obviously ends, not to jump too far ahead, but it ends with her at a complete loss to kind of provide an explanation. And I don't know, is it at about this point of the series, season 4, that some episodes start to struggle a bit to provide Scully with kind of a credible, skeptical stance? What do you think?
Well, if you remember from the 24-hour podcast, we tried to do like Quiz Tony on the X-Files, and one of the rounds that we had was the one where basically the Scully theory round, where it was like match the Scully theory to the monster explaining it. And when we were picking those, we found that the best of those, like the best Scully theories, the most outlandishly insane Scully theories, came from around season 4, because that was the point where the writers, where first of all the show was venturing so far out that you're getting stuff like time travel episodes and like psychophotography episodes. But the show hadn't gone so far that Scully had completely given up. Like later seasons where Scully would just seem to go with it and no longer offer anything resembling a logical theory. So you have in the 4th season, you have this weird mismatch where Scully is still trying to offer some sort of vaguely scientific explanation for what's happening, even though what's happening is completely barmy. And I mean, I absolutely love, we had we had, for example, the scene from Kaddish where she tries to explain how a book got on fire, suggesting that gasoline could have oozed into the coffin, and when it was exposed to air, it combusts. You have the weird thing where she's talking about advanced freezing in sort of synchronicity. But here you have even this was one of the lines, we cut this because we didn't want to do all season 4 episodes. But it's Mulder, take a look at this. See this smearousness here? I'm thinking that's heat damage. With the heater sitting under the film right there, the emulsion probably melted. Plus, the film is 2 years out of date. The photographic chemistry could have changed. The dyes, dramatic pause, fade? Question mark? And then she just gives up. And it's amazing. It's you can see that the writers and Gillian Anderson are are we still doing this 3 and a bit years into the show? Can't we just accept this and move on?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about that scene in terms of what it says about, I don't know, functional displacement or something, in terms of the history of photography, in the sense that this is at a point when film's on the decline. The guy says, doesn't he, we don't get much call for passport photos anymore. They do them over in a mall or something. But it's also at a time when digital technology is not as prevalent as it obviously will become. And I think maybe this episode would have had to be done quite differently today in terms of Jerry's unwitting ability, wouldn't it? But also, in a broader sense, you can look at the history of photography through the X-Files. If you think about the pilot, Mulder's got that enormous camera in the autopsy scene that he's kind of brandishing. Yeah. But then you go all the way through, don't you, to smartphone technology and Mulder and Scully meet the were-monster. And, Mulder taking a selfie with the blobfish in Followers. So it's kind of, you can kind of track all these things through the series, can't you?
It is indeed. And I think that, it's one of those things where I'm not even sure that during the 90s that when they were writing this they would have known that photography was on such a way out as it was. But it kind of creates this interesting sense when you're watching the show, particularly when you're watching it back now. It is a sort of a snapshot of the 90s. It is a moment in time of the 90s, and it's a transitional moment for American culture and for global culture and for technology and stuff like that. You talk about the baggy suits that Mulder was wearing, the way their mobile phones change over the course of the show. But even this sense of there's a weird kind of tactile creepiness to the world that existed in the X-Files. And if you look at the 4th season, even think of Home, for example, where you have the peacocks, the sense that the world is getting too small for the peacocks to hide in the dark shadows anymore. And even here with this thing, and I don't know how intentional it was from Gilligan and Bowman and the rest of the writing staff, but you have a sense that you couldn't tell a story like this anymore because film wouldn't exist. You'd have to explain that he was somehow manifesting himself in pixels on Photoshop or something, which would be a very strange and convoluted monster story, as opposed to this actual tactile thing that physically exists and which we can hold in our hand, which is tangible and real and actually exists. And it's kind of fascinating that it does. It almost now, watching it from the comfort of 2018, 20 years after it aired, it feels it feels almost like a sort of a nostalgia trip in a way, in that it's like, I remember when they had photographs. It's not like psychic photography was a big deal. It's I remember when photography was something that happened. And it's fascinating in that sense.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think when they go to I think they investigate the address, don't they, where the couple lived. The inspector suspects she faked the disappearance and all this. This is where Mulder finds the camera and he starts to discuss the case of Ted Sirios and the photographs. Sorry. Yeah. And I believe I'm right in saying there was a project Chris Carter and Frank Spotnitz were working on after the run of the X-Files. They wanted to do something about Ted Sirios, but one of those things, I think Carter's had a few projects that didn't really come to pass, and that was one of them. I mean, did you ever hear about that one?
Well, I mean, there's actually an article on Eat the Corn. There's an interview with them where they talk about it, where sort of they talk about like projects that they would like to do now the show is over, and you can kind of imagine that would fit sort of perfectly with their sort of interest. This sort of like late 60s bleeding into like 70s. So you've got counterculture bleeding into like paranoia, which gives you this sort of like perfect intersection of like the place to tell a story like this, and so it kind of makes sense, and it's a great like X-Files premise, because I mean, this is the thing about Unruhe, where it's kind of interesting, where the X-File is in many ways largely incidental to the plot of the episode. It's absolutely essential to the theme of the episode, and I mean, I really like that. We'll probably talk about that in a bit more depth once we get to meeting like Jerry, and once we get to talking about it a bit. But in terms of actual plot, what's remarkable about Unruhe is that so much of the plot unfolds using like standard investigative methods rather than the photographs themselves. Now, Mulder has a leap at the end once Snows has escaped, but like at the start, it's largely Scully who tracks him down using like footwork, while Mulder's off doing this like separate paranoia, sort of like paranormal thing, looking at photographs and breaking them down. Scully's actually doing the groundwork. She's looking at records. She's looking at the movements of people. She's looking at like work crews and who overlapped. She's on the ground doing interviews, and she meets Snows and realizes that something's wrong and acts on it. So like there's a sense that like the actual case here is solved, using footwork, in contrast to the weird stuff that's happening with photography. And there's actually a really great line where, Mulder says he's going off to do this. He's going off to look at the photography. And Scully's response is, what if it's not, Mulder? What if it's not important? This woman's time is running out. And Mulder's like, well, that's all the more reason to fully investigate the one and only hard piece of evidence we have. I'll be in touch. And then leaves Scully to solve the case pretty much by herself. Which I wonder if that's like Vince Gilligan having like a bit of a sort of a Darren Morgan-esque sort of laugh at Mulder's expense. But I do like that aspect of the episode. I think it makes it kind of different from other X-Files episodes where Mulder is leading the charge and Scully's kind of playing catch-up, or Scully's like providing evidence to back up his theory. Here you have Mulder running off to do his thing, and Scully actually taking the investigative lead and solving the case, because she's the one who finds him and arrests him, and they have his confession. It's only the fact that he escapes that causes problems in the second half of the episode.
Yeah, I like it too, but I also, part of me feels like I wanted a greater emphasis on the photography, because I think photography, when it appears in film and television, is a very potent motif. And like we've already mentioned Psycho, but arguably the other great horror film in 1960 is Michael Powell's Peeping Tom, about a cameraman turned killer. And that would be a great example, but also stuff like Rear Window, where James Stewart's a photographer, Blow Up, the kind of swinging 60s film by Antonioni, 1 Hour Photo with Robin Williams. There may be more you can think of too, but photography often used in stories that involve voyeurism and murder. So it's quite an interesting choice here to make it kind of an unwitting ability of Jerry's, and one he's not really cognizant of until later on.
It is indeed, and I mean, I think that like it kind of suggests something interesting. It kind of gets at what I think the episode is doing in a way that is intriguing, and kind of because I know you talked about Oubliette in like the third season with Chris as well, which, as I recall, does that also have a photographic motif where he's taking photos? Because he's a photographer and he's taking photos and he's developing them in his darkroom and stuff like that. Yeah. And you do have that link between like voyeurism and killing and stuff like that. But you also have, and this is something that happens throughout the X-Files run, which is kind of interesting. And I mean, we'll talk a little bit about the themes later on and how they intersect with like the larger things that the X-Files is concerned about in all capital letters. But in terms of like this episode as a serial killer episode, it's fascinating that Jerry's emotional state is basically leaking out into the world and imprinting itself on the nearest thing to him. In this case, like the undeveloped film, which is very similar to Oubliette, where you have that case where you have a woman who is linked to this woman who she's never met, but she has this almost empathic bond, as if it's sort of bleeding out. And you have this weird sense of connection in a world that is arbitrary and random. And this sort of becomes something where and again, it's an interesting aspect of the show. I think that like Glenn Morgan and Jim Wong talked about when they did One Breath, where it's like, The X-Files is a show where the paranormal isn't always scary, and sometimes, in some cases, the paranormal can actually be quite heartening, quite life-affirming. And I think they go into that in like The Field Where I Died later in the season, where the paranormal becomes something heartwarming. But it's interesting that in like Oubliette and here, the paranormal aspect of the case isn't... Well, the photographs are pretty creepy, if we're being honest. But it's something that actually helps the heroes stop the violence from happening. It isn't the cause of the violence, but it's something that allows Mulder and Scully to, like, solve the case and to connect to, either the killer or the victim directly. There's a sense of, like, empathy, which is a very humanist philosophy. It's the idea that, like, we are all connected in some way that we don't necessarily understand to one another, and we all have the capacity to feel or to sense things or to leave an emotional impression on the world in a way that we don't necessarily, intuit in a rational sense. And I find something very heartening in that idea in Unruhe, that, like, Schnauz is a terrible person who does horrible things, but he does those terrible things for a reason that is entirely predictable and entirely in keeping with, like, the psychology of serial killers. He could be one of the first serial killers on Millennium. He could be in that first stretch of the first season where it seems like, it's just balding white guys who hurt women, like, consistently. But what makes this an X-Files episode is the fact that he has this, that, there's this strange element of empathy, this idea that, like, that feelings can't be contained or bottled down or repressed, that they bleed out into the world, and those can be sensed and detected and felt and followed in a way that isn't strictly cold, rational and mechanical, and I kind of like that about the episode.
Yeah, because perhaps if the photography element had been foregrounded further, it would have seemed too kind of a piece with Oubliette, and this is already an episode that I think treads some familiar paths, so perhaps that would have been a mistake as well. Alright, so we got a couple of quick scenes, so just jump in on these, Darren, if anything particularly strikes you about them. So Mary turns up again at the roadside, picked up by the police, taken to hospital. There's that quite effective scene where they're looking at the brain scan, I think, where they talk about the ice pick lobotomy. What really makes it unsettling is how they talk about it being botched. Jerry doesn't know what he's doing. That's that kind of gets under your skin, I think.
Yeah, it does. And it plays into that masculine power fantasy that Gilligan's getting at, where he thinks he's helping these women, even by his own perverse logic. And even if he was doing this competently, it would still be horrific. But it's the fact that he thinks he's doing this heroic thing. This heroic thing is actually a terrible thing. And this terrible thing that he's doing is also massively incompetent. It's like it's layers of grotesquerie, like, on top of one another, which is kind of the kind of thing that Gilligan does really, really well, where he gives you so many reasons to feel uncomfortable so effectively and so quickly, and without it seeming forced. Like, there's a lot of intricacy in the horror that is Jerry Schnauz, and it's very well done.
Yeah, and, things proceed quite rapidly. There's a second abduction. We see the abducted woman. Her mouth is taped up, isn't it? And the man, we know it's Jerry, but we don't know at the time that it's Jerry, but it is speaking German to her.
I was going to say, just when he is speaking German to her, I looked up the translation, and it's things like, he puts the dressing gown on her and he says, "This is for you." It's like the one she was wearing. And you have this sense of, like, it's very clear that he's treating these women as surrogates for his sister. His missing sister, and you have this weird thing running through the episode, and I think it's entirely intentional, particularly given where Gilligan goes with, like, his second serial killer episode of the season, which is Paper Hearts, which builds upon, like, the final line of Unruhe leads directly into Paper Hearts, thematically speaking. But in terms of here, you have this idea of Schnauz treating these women as surrogates for his own sort of missing sister, or his own lost sister who committed suicide. And it's interesting because that's Gilligan. It seems like he's maybe subtly playing with, like, the central trauma of the mythology, in the same way that, Oubliette, for example, has that scene where Mulder's talking about how, that this woman isn't Samantha to him. She's somebody who's suffering, but at the same time, it's very clear that he does have empathy for her because of that experience that he has. Here you have this idea of a nuclear family that was broken down and destroyed by something, by lie. Well, by what Schnauz believes is lies that his sister told, but what was in actuality lies that his father told. And there's a sense that, that reflects the central trauma of the X-Files, where Mulder is largely coming to the fact that his father effectively, betrayed his sister. His father gave away his sister, traded her, for their security and for their comfort. And the whole Mulder family has been reeling with that trauma and trying to make sense of that trauma. And Mulder has, he hasn't constructed because it actually exists in the world of the show, but the alien conspiracy narrative of the X-Files is Mulder's way of processing what happened to his sister. And you have that interesting parallel with Schnauz, where Schnauz, in order to process what has happened with his sister, which was a very banal sort of evil. It's implied that his father abused her, she committed suicide, and Jerry refused to accept that his father could have been abusing her. And maybe that contributed to the suicide, maybe it didn't, maybe it was just guilt afterwards. But he murdered him and he lashed out, and he's been trying to reconcile with that ever since, in a way that reflects maybe Mulder's experience, where he's been trying to come to terms with what he's discovered about his father and his missing sister, and how he's sort of embroiled this mythology where Mulder has aliens to chase, Schnauz has howlers, to exorcise almost from these women. And it's an interesting sort of parallel, a way that it sort of dovetails the central thematic preoccupations of the show back to this really creepy serial killer episode that, otherwise has very little connection to the overarching mythology or story of the X-Files in a way that I find fascinating.
Yeah, because, we'll get into the mailbag at the end, of course, but one or two people raised the issue of, Scully being kidnapped again. And I think somebody says, it is fair, and we'll talk obviously more about that specifically when we get there, but somebody said, you could have had the same effect if Mulder had been the one taken. But I don't know if you could, in the sense that you'd have had to work backwards to scene one of this episode, wouldn't you? And it would have meant a fundamental change in kind of the characterization of Jerry Schnauz.
It would have meant changing the pathology as well, and it would have meant, I think you're entirely right when you say that Scully's arc in this episode isn't necessarily developed particularly well, and there is some uncomfortable subtext, which we'll probably get to when we get to the closing scene as well, which you couldn't necessarily have with Mulder, I don't think, in that I don't think, Mulder is inevitably going to be drawn to the psychic photography aspect of the case. So he's not going to be the kind of person who will see Schnauz as a person, or see Schnauz as a man, or see him as a monster. You get a sense that if Mulder were tied down in that dentist chair, he'd still be wondering how Schnauz does what he does with the film. Whereas if you have Scully in that chair, you get a much tighter focus on Schnauz as a broken man or a monster or both, or reconciling those two. In a way that I don't think you could do this episode with Mulder. I don't think it does it perfectly with Scully either, and we'll probably talk about that when we get to the closing scene, the monologue at the end. But I think the episode fundamentally, I can't see it working with Mulder and Scully swapping roles.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. And let's see where we are. So there's a crime scene, isn't there, with a dead accountant. His secretary's the one who's gone missing. And I think one of the things this scene does is establish that Scully knows a bit of German. She studied it at college. That obviously comes into play at the end. This is where Scully notices the logo of the construction company. What if the killer works for them? And of course, this is where they split up for a while, isn't it? So, yeah, I think a reasonable job of justifying them splitting up. In some episodes it can seem a bit tenuous, and occasionally maybe it seems like it's driven more by logistics in terms of, how many days we got with David and Gillian on set this week or whatever. But I didn't really feel that here. I don't know.
And there's also some very efficient storytelling from Gilligan as well. Part of me wonders, watching Unruhe and watching Paper Hearts, Gilligan's a, by all accounts, he gives fantastic interviews. He's a wonderful man. He's very generous. He's been described as one of the nicest men in Hollywood. But when you watch his episodes, there's also a sense that Gilligan has a wry sense of humor in terms of his storytelling, and in terms of what he's doing, and in terms of what he's commenting upon. And I would not, for example, be as cynical or as harsh on him as some fans are when it comes to stuff like, say, Sunshine Days at the end of the 9th season, where a lot of people interpreted what Gilligan was doing there as a very direct sort of take that at the fans. But there is a sense that I wonder, when I watch Unruhe and I watch Paper Hearts, and I look at the fact that while they were doing these episodes, Carter was off massively promoting Millennium for Fox and focusing a lot of his attention on the development of his new show, whether Gilligan was sort of having a bit of fun at the expense of Millennium by writing 2 episodes that could have been episodes of Millennium very, very easily. It's very easy to imagine like reworking Unruhe as a Millennium plot. It's very easy to imagine even reworking Paper Hearts as a Millennium plot. You just have to strip out the Mulder aspect of it, which is the heart of the episode, admittedly. But like you could do something similar with Frank and like Frank and a serial killer that he caught. And in fact, they do something similar, I think, in the Thin White Line in the middle of the season. Yeah. But like you get a sense. Part of me wonders if Gilligan was having like a bit of a wry smirk and sort of saying, "Well, look, Fox has this shiny new serial killer show that's airing on Fridays." In our slot, what was our slot? And it's worth noting, by the way, that there are interviews from people like Carter around the time of the transition. Now, the move from Friday to Sunday turned out to be like a massive boom for the show. It got the show the highest ratings. It was the point at which the show exploded into a massive cultural phenomenon. You know, it was building to that through the 3rd season, but it was a huge thing from like the 4th through the 6th seasons of the show. And a large part of that was down to the move to Sunday nights, where it was partnered with shows like, for example, The Simpsons, which was another sort of juggernaut as well. But at the time, like a lot of the writers and a lot of the commenters would have been talking in interviews. Like I think Carter described The X-Files as being abducted to Sunday nights. And you have stuff like Carter giving other interviews where he's talking about, I think Friday night is a good night to be scared, right? And you got a sense that maybe like, there was a sense in which the writers were a little bit skeptical about like the sexy new kid on the block, which was like Chris Carter's Millennium, which got this huge push from Fox. And I wonder if there's a sense, looking at Gilligan's first 2 scripts for the 4th season, which are Unruhe and Paper Hearts, if Gilligan wasn't with a little smirk on his face saying, well, look, the X-Files can do absolutely everything that Millennium can do, but we can also do psychic photography and paranormal, like Tom Noonan tracking through Mulder's dreams as well. So screw you guys.
Yeah, because I think I've also seen interviews with him where he says things like, I watch Millennium every week, and but it's the kind of show you need a shower afterwards, and just unremittingly grim.
And he loved it. Now he does love it. He's come out and he said he loves it, and he used I think he borrowed some of the music cues from the show for Breaking Bad as well. So I don't think it's an element of dear God did I hate that show, but I do think that he was aware of it.
No, but I think perhaps cognizant of the fact that because you've got things in the mix here like psychic photography and the banter, of course, between Mulder and Scully, the mix is a bit more palatable for a mainstream audience, of course. Yeah. And all right, so another scene in the dark room, a man taping up the second woman. Again, we can't see his face still speaking German. Followed by, a succession, I think, of quite brief kind of plot-driven scenes. So Mulder working with the imaging expert to alter the photos. Maybe a missed opportunity to get someone like Chuck Burks, a lone gunman, in, but no, this guy's fine, I suppose.
He's perfectly adequate. Solid 3-star Yelp review. I do like, by the way, that the photographs look almost like the opening credits of the X-Files. Like they have that same sort of like impressionistic quality to them that I really like, and it sort of suggests to me like the way that like if it's psychic photography, like so if you have this idea of film that like Schnauz is imprinting on it. By the way, it should be noted that Schnauz, one of Gilligan's closest friends, and I believe his college roommate, was named Tom Schnauz, and you can see that the father in the graveyard is Gerard Thomas Schnauz, which by the way I imagine is a great shout out that Tom Schnauz really loved. He worked on the 9th season of the X-Files, he worked on Lone Gunman, and he also worked on Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. But if Schnauz can impress his like psychic, sort of fingerprint on this film, part of me wonders like, is Gilligan suggesting that like the X-Files is like the zeitgeist imprinting its psychic, sort of mindset on like actual film, particularly because the photos that we see like of the women with like the warped shadows and particularly the bent shape, the bit where he realizes that he's either tall or wants to be, like that's the shadow stretched across the screen in a way that reminds me of the silhouette in the opening sequence of the X-Files, where you have the sort of shadow that's warped slightly. It reminds me of that a lot, and I wonder if Gilligan's sort of getting at that idea of like the X-Files in particular, but also art in general, as like something where the collective consciousness, you want to talk about Freudian, this is incredibly Freudian, but the idea of something on which like the collective consciousness, or maybe Jungian perhaps, but like the collective consciousness expresses itself like impressionistically. So it's not literally about serial killers or aliens, it's actually just about our deep-seated fears about family, or our deep-seated fears about where society's going. We just happen to create these images that are abstract expressions of that, like say the silhouette, the leering image of his father, the woman screaming, the bullet wound in his head, that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I really do like the idea of like the leakage here of like Jerry's kind of psychology, his monstrosity, because I think in a lot of times in horror, monstrosity is kind of contained within the psyche, isn't it? So Norman Bates would be an example where he's not, you know, in outward appearances, he's not a monster, but it is in terms of his thoughts and his actions. Hannibal Lecter, of course, has got his memory palace or whatever it is in certain iterations of the adaptations of the books. Yeah. Well, here with Jerry, it's kind of spilling out, isn't it? Which is an interesting idea.
It is indeed. Just by the way, actually, when you mentioned Hannibal Lecter, worth noting that in the books, Lecter has 6 fingers, and one of the things Mulder notices about the photo is that the person in the photo has 6 fingers on their hands as well, which is a nice touch. Now, obviously, it turns out to be the tombstones and stuff, but I thought that was a nice. I wonder if, like the reference to Psycho at the start, if that was Gilligan playing with like his serial killer pop culture knowledge.
Yeah, and doesn't Red Dragon, now it's been a little while, so just remind me, but doesn't that involve a photographer in some way?
It does indeed.
With Dollarhide.
That's it. Dollarhide is picking his victims by developing film, which again is a concept that you can't really do now. In fact, like you'd argue, that's one of the reasons why when Brett Ratner made Red Dragon, he had to set it as a period piece in the 80s, was because you sent off your photos to be developed. And like it was a massive twist. I remember reading that like in the late 90s when I was like a teenager. And I remember being mind blown at how good a twist that was. You send off your photos to this anonymous person, and this anonymous person turns out to be like picking his victims from it. If I read that book today for the first time as a teenager, I'd be like, why didn't they just press print on the computer? It would save a lot of this bother. All
right, so there's that scene, isn't there, at the kind of deserted construction site? I think everybody's at lunch, is what they say. Great location, first of all.
Yeah,
I think they really did well picking that out. We meet Jerry Schnauz, played by Pruitt Taylor Vince, on stilts. He apparently is the foreman. So this is where we get Mulder calls Scully. The kidnapper's legs are unusually long, you know, and so on. Scully kind of makes the connection, of course, pulls the gun on Jerry. He flees. She gives chase. Eventually, she catches up with him. Gets kind of pricked, doesn't she, when she puts her hand in his pocket and finds the ice pick. And I just wanted to pick up, I mean, we can talk about the scene generally, but there's a point I think that could be worth exploring here about his eyes, because Pruitt Taylor Vince has a condition which I believe is called nystagmus, which is something that causes involuntary movement of the eyes. And from what I can gather, it can be caused by a variety of things like head injuries or multiple sclerosis and so on. But the way the close-ups on his eyes are used in this episode, like the close-ups on Jerry, it's with his darting eye movements, it's positioned, I think, to make the character appear more foreboding. So I don't know if I think it's very effective, but I wonder if it's a little reductive in terms of it, the sort of suggestion it kind of makes. So what do you feel?
It's very gothic horror, and it's worth noting, of course, like the serial killer genre as a whole is incredibly like steeped in gothic horror. Like you want to talk about Hannibal Lecter. I had a conversation with somebody here who like wrote books on like the American Gothic, and her argument is, Hannibal Lecter is basically, he may be a cannibal, but he's also a psychic vampire. And you have stuff like even Grotesque, if you think about Grotesque from the 3rd season, is a serial killer narrative, but it's populated with gargoyles and all these sort of gothic symbols. Even here, like you point to the location being fantastic, which is like, but it's covered in all these plastic sheets and tarps, which, you know, obviously like for a certain generation of people, they embody like Lethal Weapon 2, very easy to clean up a crime scene if you got lots of tarp lying around. And also like a really cool place to have like an action sequence as a DIY sort of sequence. But they also they look more like, they kind of, to me at least, remind me of sort of like Gothic castles, where everything's covered in dust and everything's sort of like broken down and everything's being put together. And you're right that there is the use, the way that the camera focuses, particularly on his eye, and particularly like with the stilts, it's very much in that, again, it's that sort of Gothic idea of like physical monstrosity or physical difference. Sorry, I shouldn't have said monstrosity, but physical difference being used to represent some sort of like abstract monstrosity. And you think of, for example, of Igor the Hunchback, who appears in like, you know, various tellings of Frankenstein. You think of the idea of like, using physical difference as a marker to distinguish somebody as other. Like even the Bond franchise uses it, for example. I think like even Ian Fleming was reaching the point of like parodic self-awareness when you get to the man with the golden gun, and Scaramanga's weird disfigurement is that he has a third nipple. But you have like even say, and again, this is something that's taken, I think you can point to like the influence of like of Thomas Harris on like obviously on Millennium and stuff like that, and obviously on like Silence of the Lambs as an influence creating Scully, but on Gilligan writing the script for both this and for Paper Hearts later in the season, because Harris repeatedly uses this idea of physical monstrosity, physical difference, as a representation of like innate monstrousness. So, for example, you think of Francis Dollarhide, who like literally takes bites out of people and goes out into the backyard to howl at the moon like a werewolf. He has a cleft palate, and he has these teeth that he puts in. You think of James Gum, who is physically building himself a suit out of women. You have, for example, Hannibal Lecter, who, while in the films is played by Anthony Hopkins and, doesn't have any real marks of otherness. You have in the books, you have like the description of his eyes, which are piercing. You have the 6 fingers that we talked about as well. And these are not things that are necessarily like reflective of like how serial killers are in the real world. They're more reflections of like the serial killer story as like a modern day non-supernatural or like less supernatural iteration of the same sort of stories that we used to tell about werewolves or vampires or monsters lurking in the darkness. And I think you're right. You're right that it's both effective and unsettling for reasons that I don't think that the writer and director would have intended it to be unsettling, where you're like, that's like, it's okay for somebody to have like an eye like that. It doesn't mean they're a serial killer. Why are you shooting the fact that he has an eye like that as if to suggest to the audience, well, he's definitely a serial killer? That makes me a little uncomfortable that you're making that assumption. But at the same time, you're right that it is also effective, and it's that weird push and pull between the two. I don't think it's ill-intentioned. I don't think that, like, for 1 second that anybody involved in the production thinks that people who have a disability like that or a sort of an attribute like that, are inherently monstrous. But I do think that it's steeped in this idea of genre tropes and conventions that mean that you do end up with stuff. It's like when we talked about Hell Money, where like a lot of the stuff on the show like can seem awkward when you view it in hindsight, and I don't think there's any malice there. I absolutely do not think there's any malice there. I think that there's a lot of stuff where they're playing on tropes and conventions in a way that isn't necessarily like very well thought through the implications of it. And I think there is definitely something there.
Yeah, I feel it's I think inadvertent, that it may perpetuate some kind of
othering or
regrettable othering stereotypes, however you want to put it. All right, so they interrogate him. Scully kind of leading the interrogation first of all. He's kind of pleading ignorant, isn't he? The ice picks for the sheetrock, and I don't know what you're talking about, etc., etc. But it's when Mulder brings up his criminal record, isn't it, that things start to change. So we get the backstory you've kind of referred to about how Jerry attacked his father, was treated for a paranoid schizophrenic disorder, but his father died quite recently, and that's what seems to have triggered his recent killings, I suppose. This is where Scully, or when he says to Scully, "You look troubled," and I don't know, I wonder if Mulder and Scully should have picked up on that a little more. It seems like if they were a little more alert, they would have sussed that he was kind of sizing up Scully at that moment.
It was indeed. Now, to be fair, I think that like the rest of the episode happens so quickly that there's never really any sense. Like, I don't think that I don't think there was a moment where Mulder would have noticed or would have thought to say, well, actually, he expressed an interest in you, so we should probably have you on guard. But there is definitely a sense there. It is a sense, I think it's more for the audience's benefit than for Mulder and Scully's, in that it's to explain that, well, he has an interest, and the way that it's shot as well, it's very clearly communicated by Bowman as well, that that's where this is sort of going. There's the glancing and the looking and the seeing, and like drawing the audience's attention to where it needs to go. And I understand that, it is maybe a slight plot gap that Mulder doesn't twig on it, particularly as he's a brilliant forensic profiler, apparently. But I think it is a concession to like narrative, like efficiency, which is like you need the audience to understand why he goes after Scully. And that provides like a reason or explanation, which is like if he believes that he needs to help women who are troubled, having him identify Scully as someone who is troubled explains why he targets her specifically.
Yeah, it's definitely very economical, I think. Yeah. And this scene is where the idea of the Howlers comes up. And some people have pointed to this as kind of a foreshadowing of the Scully cancer arc. And I don't know, I just think in terms of nuts and bolts, it must have been unwitting, because I think all the stories you read of it, Memento Mori was kind of thrown together when a Darren Morgan script fell through. So I don't know if it was kind of explicit foreshadowing in that sense. But what do you think? I'm not sure it kind of holds up.
It doesn't, but I mean, it's also, again, this is the thing where we talk about the X-Files and how stuff fits together, and I've kind of, like, I would argue that you do see recurring motifs and you do see recurring themes, and they express similar underlying ideas, if not necessarily expressing the exact same thing. And I think, like, it is it is clear that Scully does have, like, baggage. And I mean, Mulder obviously has baggage as well. That's not to be dismissive of Scully in any way, shape, or form. But, like, Scully is troubled in a sense in that, like, she's been through a hell of an ordeal, even if it was 2 years ago. And she does have this stuff sort of swirling around her. And I think that you can kind of draw that connection, because the cancer is itself an expression of, like, the long-term suffering that she experienced as a result of, you know, the trauma that she experienced. And you can maybe draw a connection there. You could argue that, like, she's troubled by this idea, you know, and again, this is the idea of, like, the big ideas and small ideas. The big idea of the mythology is that you have powerful men in suits who are victimizing women and conducting horrific experiments on them. In this episode, what do you have? But you have a singular man acting on his own, but he's taking women and performing, like, horrific, grotesque parodies of medical experiments upon them. It's the same sort of, like, the same core, like, trauma and anxiety that underpins a lot of the mythology, which is this idea of women's bodily autonomy not being entirely their own and being subjected to horrific violations by men. And now it just so happens that, you know, in this case, Schnauz isn't, like, an expression of systemic violence against women, or systemic repression of women's rights to control their own body or bodily autonomy. It's just one man who's, you know, basically violating a woman's autonomy. But I can understand, you know, you could argue that maybe Scully's response to him in that light is informed by her own experiences, like first-hand experiences of that sort of, sort of conduct in the past. And if that's the case, then if that sense of unrest is something that he sees represented in the Howlers, maybe you could argue that, like, the cancer is itself an ultimate expression of that as well, and that it's an expression of something that is literally under her skin, that's been growing inside of her, that's been sort of, you know, that's been lingering there underneath the surface, you know, with no real awareness or acknowledgement of it, but still causing very serious harm to her. So maybe there is. I don't know.
All right, so there's another scene. Like, you know, they find the character of Alice dead. This is where Scully kind of walks away. She's kind of somewhat shaken. Mulder's still very interested in trying to get to the bottom of what Jerry was thinking, but Scully doesn't want to know at this point. And I think it's around this part, this part of the episode, and especially with the next scene, which is Jerry at the police station, eventually escaping from custody, that I'm starting to wonder if this episode is too redolent of Irresistible, maybe in terms of its structure. You know, in the sense that obviously both episodes are about killers of women, but in both of them, the perpetrator is taken into custody partway through the episode, gets out in some way. I think Donnie Faster's kind of released because the woman doesn't press charges. Jerry kind of breaks out, it seems. Yeah. And then Scully gets abducted, and I don't know if the similarity was too overt for me on this viewing.
Oh yeah, and they both, like, latch on to Scully while they're in custody. Now it's different because Schnauz is in custody for what he actually did, whereas it turns out that Faster just happens to be in the police station while Scully's there. But yeah, you definitely have that sense of overlap between the two stories. And I was actually thinking about that myself.
Yeah, and of course they're both holding down jobs, Donnie and Jerry. I think that one thing I've always felt about Irresistible is finding it a little hard to imagine Donnie Faster holding down his job, leading a normal life without attracting suspicion. Yeah. I think perhaps with Jerry, I felt it a little more convincing here.
Yeah.
You know, those first few seconds where he talks to Scully, he seems to fit the kind of how you'd imagine a foreman to be quite well, I think. And I don't know.
And he's also very good in at least before Mulder brings up, like, the family trauma, he's really good in the interrogation room. And again, like, this feels like a really weird thing to say about a killer. It's like, he's really good in the interrogation room. He's got this down pat. But he catches Mulder trying to catch him with the names and trying to keep him off balance. There's a bit where Mulder names several victims, and he's like, wait a minute, you were talking about another girl a moment ago. As if to say, like, I don't know what you're talking about. What are you doing? What's going on here? And his game is actually really good to the point where you believe, like, if this were a Law and Order episode, you would cut to the courtroom. The second half of the episode would be Jerry Schnauz in the courtroom with a really good lawyer being like, well, my client couldn't possibly have done this. Of course, because of the X-Files, he ends up shooting a police officer in the head and sneaking out the back door of the worst guarded police station in the world. But yeah, I think that Jerry is, despite the fact that he gets a lot less screen time than Donnie, despite the fact he gets a lot less attention than Donnie, and despite the fact that, you know, maybe he's a bit less iconically creepy than Donnie, he is, perhaps, it's easier to believe that he could move through the world unnoticed. I think you're sort of right on that point. I would agree with you on that.
Yeah, and I do really like Irresistible, but he definitely becomes faster he becomes more of a kind of a slasher film figure as it goes on. And by the end of it, he's kind of spitting out catchphrases, it seems like. And I didn't necessarily feel that way about Jerry, which I thought worked in this episode's favour.
You can't imagine ever going out to work drinks and not finding Donnie extremely off-putting. You would just sitting there at the bar by himself, like commenting on, your female co-worker's hair in the way that he does while calling her girly girl. Whereas you can kind of believe that maybe Jerry would be, like, he'd be quiet, he'd be reserved, he wouldn't say much, but he'd probably stand in a group of people where he wouldn't be noticed, and you would accept that he's there. Yeah, I think there is an aspect of that. Now I'm imagining what drinks with Donnie would be like.
Well, yeah, I think that's why I've never quite bought the kind of boy next door aspect they tried to pin on faster in Irresistible. It just didn't seem that convincing to me. But let's return to Unruhe, which proceeds with, I think Jerry, once he breaks out, he breaks into the drugstore, doesn't he? And he wants all the photo stuff, and he wants all this stuff to make Twilight sleep. And this is where Scully and Mulder investigate. And there's that great, well, I say great, but that scene where Scully goes out to bring the car round and she gets the needle kind of stabbed into her foot. Just kind of horrific, I think. And a couple of people in the mailbag have said, they've always kind of checked under their cars ever since they saw that scene. And I can imagine, I can fully understand why.
Oh yeah, no, it's again, it's one of those primal sort of fears. Again, that's the X-Files doing what it does very well, which is channel these sort of 90s fears. Because, like, in the 90s, you had, like, this huge obsession with serial killers and this fear that you could be a victim of random violence. I mean, you argue serial killers, it's also a case with, like, gang violence as well, in certain parts of America in the 90s. There was this fear of, like, random sweeping violence, that you were never safe anywhere, that there was somebody lurking, like, the famous story about the guy in, the person who keeps getting flashed in their car, and it turns out to be because there's a serial killer in the back seat. That sort of thing. It's like, well, somebody's waiting under your car to slash you and hurt you, and there's nothing you can do that will keep you safe. It's a very primal fear. It's a very relatable fear. And it's something that the X-Files taps into ridiculously well. And it's something that I think, like, this explains why you could have a show like Millennium, where you would have 24 different serial killer episodes a year, in theory. Now, I know it didn't turn out like that, but in theory, you could hope to make 24 episodes where each serial killer is slightly different, because there was so much fear in the 90s and things like that. We're talking about, like, Silence of the Lambs, talking about Seven, talking about Kiss the Girls, that sort of stuff. Copycat, even, to pick another example. Yeah. Like, you had this fear of random violence in spaces that were supposed to be safe during the 90s, which I think, and there's a whole bigger debate to be had about, like, whether that was a result of, like, the end of the Cold War, meaning that nobody really felt like the enemy was over there anymore. Instead, we had to have this anxiety about the world which we move through every day. There was no clear, like, rigid, like, moral structure like the evil empire to define us, so the world seemed more scary and arbitrary than it used to be. But the X-Files kind of taps into that, and it makes sense that it would work so well, where it's just like, sometimes it's a monster that sneaks through an air vent and eats your liver, and sometimes it's just a dude in a creepy rain mac underneath your car going to stab you with a needle to make you go asleep. And those are equally terrifying.
Yeah, and I think we should then discuss these repeated instances of Scully being kidnapped, because this is what happens, of course. And I suppose, for me, the most egregious example in the first few seasons is the one in Our Town, where, that didn't seem fundamental to the episode. That could have been anyone else. It could have been Mulder. It could have been another secondary character. This one, as we've said, seems a bit more congruent with the story and the tone they're going for and everything. But it does feel a bit like diminishing returns are kicking in to me.
It does indeed. And I mean, like, it's worth noting that in Our Town, even Frank Spotnitz, the writer of the episode, was like, well, maybe I should have, sort of toned that down a bit. Maybe we should have sort of, like, looked at the net Scully kidnap count at the end of the season. And I think it's right. I think that, it does happen quite a bit. It does happen a bit too often. And it probably shouldn't have happened as often as it did. That said, if I were to narrow down, like, Scully being kidnapped to a handful of episodes, this would be one of the last ones I would cut that from, I think. But yeah, it is entirely an absolutely fair observation that it does victimize Scully a little bit. And I think that there's maybe one of the things about the episode that made me a little bit uncomfortable when I watched it, and still does, if I'm being entirely honest, is the weird sense that, like, and again, I don't think this is intentional on anybody's part involved in writing the episode. It's just the way that the episode plays out. But it seems like Scully is being taught a lesson in the episode in a way that's really uncomfortable. Because she spends a lot of the episode talking about how she doesn't really care about Jerry Snow's, and she doesn't really care about the monsters and explanations and internal logic that drives him, because he's just a dude who kills women, and we should probably investigate him, catch him, and arrest him. You go look at those pretty pictures all you want, Mulder, but there's a woman out there being kidnapped, and actual legwork is going to solve this. And it kind of does, until it doesn't. And then Scully gets kidnapped, and she gets put in a position where she has to use that knowledge that she gained from the photos, in which she wasn't interested, in which she sort of dismissed Mulder's interest in kind of casually. And she has to use that knowledge in order to play him and to keep him from, just buy a couple of minutes to allow Mulder to get to her to save her. And then at the end, she has this epiphany that never feels entirely earned to me, if we're being very honest about it, which is this thing where it's like, sometimes it's necessary to stare at monsters and to understand monsters. As if to say that she was kind of wrong at the start when she was dismissive of the photographs. And there's a reading of the episode where you can look at it as Scully being sort of like taught a lesson that makes me feel very uncomfortable watching the episode. It's like, well, she's being sort of, and again, I don't want to say put in her place, but you could read it that way, and it does make me a little uncomfortable watching the episode.
Yeah, to be honest, we'll talk a little more in due course, but I felt the episode didn't really nail that aspect, and I didn't think the final voiceover was quite up to par with the rest of the episode, in truth. But we get, Mulder makes the link with Jerry's dad, who's a retired dentist, and I don't know, I think if I was in the dentistry profession, I'd probably be quite sick of like film and TV shows that perpetuate this idea of dentists and dentistry as something quite sinister. I suppose the classic example in terms of cinema would be something like Marathon Man with...
Is it safe?
Is it safe? Exactly. But it goes back to what we said, I guess, about like in the bathroom in Psycho. It's a place, isn't it, a dentist, where you're very vulnerable. Yeah. It is a common phobia, in fairness. I mean, I'm quite lucky. I've never needed any fillings or anything, ever had anything amiss with my teeth, really. But I know people who just kind of dread
going to
seeing a dentist. So I think that it's not surprising people exploit these settings for drama.
Well, it's interesting that you should describe it as like, sort of being sick and tired of seeing dentists being treated as something monstrous and scary. It's kind of interesting because that's not the first stereotype I think of when I think of TV dentists. I actually think of how boring they are. Like, I think that there's like a recurring joke in pop culture about how dentistry is like doctors who aren't actually capable of being doctors. And so you have this idea that people who are dentists are very boring, and you see it a lot. Like, I think, for example, of the character, was it Bryan Cranston played in Seinfeld, who was the dentist who was he the dentist? Yeah. And I think of, for example, Rachel's first Barry, her husband to be in Friends, where he's presented as a bit of a loser. And again, the shortcut to getting that is that he's a dentist. And I also think even of more recently, like Bohemian Rhapsody was out very recently. And isn't it is it Roger Taylor? Was it going to be a dentist? And like Freddie Mercury repeatedly points out how incredibly boring that is. And I kind of I feel like, dentists do absolutely get a bum rap in pop culture. And part of me wonders, is it better or worse? Would you rather be like the sitcom dentist, where the joke is that you're like a doctor who didn't make it and you're just very boring? Or would you rather be like the action movie thriller dentist, where you're actually probably likely to be some sort of serial killer who straps people into your chair and tortures them for your own amusement? It's kind of interesting that there's that dichotomy between portrayals of dentistry in pop culture to me.
Yeah, well, I was thinking of the 1996 slasher film, The Dentist, with Corbin Bernsen, which I haven't seen, but I think I've seen a trailer for it or something. And let me just read you the description here, which is, Dr. Alan Feinstein is a rich and successful Beverly Hills dentist. There's only one problem. He's insane. And Dr. Feinstein loves perfection, and he expects it of everyone. Unfortunately, no one is perfect. This unacceptable fact annoys the good doctor and leads him to commit his one small imperfection: murder. So I think it's what you're saying though. There's kind of a dearth of positive images of dentists in pop culture, unless we're mistaken. If anyone knows of any heroic dentists, let us know, I suppose.
That's the new Freddie Highmore series, The Good Dentist, coming next year. Yeah, there is actually. I'm trying to think, is there like a good dentist, or like a dentist who's portrayed as somebody who's entirely comfortable with what they're doing and what they're doing is worth doing in pop culture? There has to be at least one, right? I'm
stumped. There's got to be one. If not, there should be.
Yeah, it would be a crowning accomplishment of the medium, I think.
I'm not fast enough to respond to that, but yeah. I mean, so we got these final scenes, haven't we? Scully's in the dentist chair. Jerry speaking German to her. She buys herself some time by speaking German back. You know, I don't need to be saved, and so on. They talk about the howlers. I just don't think we get enough of this stuff in the sense, in the sense that the episode puts a lot of weight on their exchange when we get to that final voiceover, and I just don't think it comes across. It comes across to me that Scully's very ingenious. You know, she's obviously using her skills in terms of her language skills and so on, and her FBI training. But I'm not sure what we see here tallies up exactly with what they say later. I don't know.
Yeah, it doesn't really work as a character piece. And again, like, I really like the episode in terms of like the thematic stuff, because you have that bit where it's like, you know, where Scully's like, why me, Jerry? Do I remind you of your sister? You know, that sort of stuff. And you have that sense that like the show is getting at like underlying trauma and this idea that like we chase monsters because we can't confront the reality of like the traumas that we've suffered directly, which is like something that plays out across the entire run of the X-Files. And I think that stuff is fascinating here. And I think that stuff works really, really well. I pointed out that, you know, again, like you're dealing with a broken family unit that reflects the Mulder family unit, where you have a patriarch who failed his children, you know, a sister who is lost, and a young boy who's constructed a mythology to make sense of it all. I think all that stuff is very interesting, very clever. But I think, yeah, the Scully stuff just doesn't really work. And the thing is with it's got like, we're at the stage where we talked about the show sort of phasing out the, like, you know, the Scully explanations, because the writers were like, these don't necessarily really work with the stories that we're telling at this point in the run. And like, this is weird because it's one of the rare standalone episodes, I think, at this point in the show. Like, they sort of drifted away from the season 1 and season 2, like, let's summarize the case with a closing monologue. And it just feels really odd because the episode doesn't make the leap that it needs to make to get there. And it's kind of strange because, like, I mentioned this earlier, but the closing line of the episode, which is like, you know, to fully pursue monsters, we must understand them. We must venture into their minds. In doing so, do we risk letting them venture into ours? That's the entire premise of Paper Hearts. That's not the premise of the episode that we just watched. And I don't feel like it entirely earns it, which is kind of strange for an episode that I like as much as I like this.
I agree, and I think that in terms of understanding monsters, that was terrain that was covered with Mulder more wholeheartedly and grotesque, wasn't it? And Kim Manners, I mean, you mentioned that Bowman may not have been a good fit for episodes like Orison, for example. I mean, he is a good fit for this in terms of the episode's kinetic energy and everything, but Manners wouldn't have flinched away from some of the kind of psychological stuff or so on. And I think it would have been reflected in like his approach. Like, there's a great scene in Grotesque where the camera revolves around Scully as she enters Mulder's apartment, and it takes in all the kind of drawings and so on. And nothing quite that kind of powerful here. Maybe that's unfair, I don't know.
But yeah, that's sort of like that really intense, like, atmospheric stuff. I think like David Nutter does it very well as well in the early seasons, where you have like, you're willing to do something that feels stylized. And I mean, and Bowman is a very, very good stylized. He can do stylized direction, stuff like that. But he tends to work more in an action movie mold. He doesn't like place the camera at like weird angles. He isn't very fond of like Dutch angles or like low angles and stuff like that you generally use or require in a serial killer narrative. He's very good at like positioning the camera to follow the characters and to get a sense of momentum and movement. But he's not like... I'm trying to think of like genuinely scary Rob Bowman episodes. Bowman couldn't have done Home, I think, for example, in the way that Manners does. And like, you just look at the opening sequence of Home, where you have a Dutch angle, you have flashes of lightning, you have rain pelting down, you have these insert shots of the shovel, all of which are like, they're all horror movie cliches, but they're done with such skill and such efficiency that they work. And I mean, I don't think that like Bowman's direction here is a huge problem, but it is lacking in a sense that like, I'm never, you know, we talked about how we're scared of the idea of Schnauz hiding underneath the car. I'm never really scared of that scene itself as it plays. You know, it's never shot in a way that's like suspenseful, because it's like you see her feet, and then he's there, and then he stabs her with a syringe, and that's it. There's never a sense of building momentum. There's never a sense of, is she going to move her feet? There's never a sense of like, is this going to happen? It might not happen. And you can argue that like, there's something maybe good in that it's less exploitative, in that Bowman's direction generally doesn't feel like trashy and exploitative, which is perhaps why I think Gender Bender works much, much better than it should, because it never feels as pulpy and trashy as like the basic premise of the episode suggests. And it's also, I think, an issue with Orison later on, where the episode is Bowman like refuses to do that exploitative stuff with the shots with the prostitute. He refuses to position the camera and put the audience in a position where they're like, are we root? Do we want to see this kill? Is this kill like, are we excited by what we're about to see here, this horrific thing? Bowman just refuses to do that in a way that I think is, you could argue, is like commendable as a director, in that he's not objectifying his female performers, and he's not like being exploitative, and he's not asking his audience to root for like violence and horror and suffering of itself. But it does take a little bit of the edge off like horror movie direction, because it's very, I don't want to say matter of fact, because that sounds dismissive of like his talent. I think he's one of the best directors working on the show, but it's a lot less stylized in a way that horror direction tends to be stylized, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think it's all relative, isn't it? Because we're comparing him, for example, to people like David Nutter or Kim Manners, I think, is the classic example. Someone who was kind of unflinching about these things. Yeah. And I just remember Chris Knowles saying to me about Bowman on one of the Podwatch episodes we did. I can't remember which one, but that Bowman, he's from the Midwest. He's quite a conservative guy in like a small C sense. Yeah. Had real trouble with things like he had to do the walk, which has the scene with the boy being killed in the sandpit, for example. And kind of wrestling with these things. And
I can believe that, looking at his work. Like, I can honestly watch Orison and think that he was a director looking at it, and he's like, I really don't want to make an episode where the audience is wondering, is this innocent woman going to get murdered? Which is a fair point. It's a legitimate point for a director to make, but it means if you're making a show about a serial killer, as you are in Orison, it means you have an entire middle section where the momentum just doesn't work, because the scene with the prostitute in the apartment is just shot very matter-of-factly. It's not leering, it's not voyeuristic, and while that's good, it's not effective, which is an interesting dichotomy,
Just wanted to make one point, which I think this kind of rescue situation, what makes it work as well as it does, I think, is that because Scully's granted a degree of agency, isn't she, in the sense that, she talks Jerry down. It's not just as simple as like Our Town, which is the one where Mulder just turns up at the last minute and saves her. Scully kind of bought herself some time, so I think in that respect it's pretty well done.
It is indeed, and I mean, even when like he's distracted, you can see her trying to reach for the tray and stuff like that. She's constantly trying. She's not a victim. Well, she is a victim in that she's tied to a chair, but she's not a passive victim in a way, which sort of grants her that agency. In a way that I think allows me to overlook, like I talked about how if I were cutting Scully in Peril episodes, this would be rather low down the list, and that would be rather low down the list because of little touches like that, where she stalls for time with Jerry, for example, or she manages to get her hand free at the end when Mulder's breaking in as well, which is nice. It means that it's not Mulder who frees her at the end of the episode.
All right, Darren. Well, I think we've covered this one fairly well, but we had some great stuff in the mailbag this week. So, yeah, I think we should see what our listeners have to say. And we'll start with Marlene Stemme. So this was a nice take on it, I thought. I'll read it in full because I think it deserves it. So she says, I've always had a mixed reaction to Unruhe. It has some great and affecting moments, such as Scully on the phone with Mulder recognising that she is with the killer, Scully recognising the commonality of the construction company across crimes in a nice secondary use of photography, and Gillian's entire performance of increasing angst, particularly those final tense scenes with Jerry Schnauz. On the other hand, Vince Gilligan gives no plausible explanation to explain thought photography, only that Mulder has heard of it in the case of Ted Sirios. I greatly dislike that no real attempt is made to make the phenomena reasonable, only that Mulder knows about it. This seems to be the beginning of that trend in the series. Also, Mulder's insight is given too much credit. Had he paid a smidgen more attention in the interrogation scene with Schnauz, he might have surmised that Schnauz had latched onto Scully as a potential victim. I'm not so bothered that Scully is the victim, as I am that Mulder is undeservedly the rescuing hero. I think the tension between their methods is interesting and well played by both, but Scully's contribution is diminished. She puts together the evidence that found the killer. Mulder's special insight, while valuable, was necessary in this case only because he didn't pay attention to reality in the first place. Yet the episode's conclusion seems to herald his ways. I think this makes aspects of the episode seem trite, which is a shame because it's a fascinating premise with genuinely unsettling moments and creepy atmosphere, and in some ways is a good character stroke investigative piece for Scully. And I think that's well argued. I think, by the sounds of it, I'm a little fond of the episode of Marlene. It sounds like you are too, but I think she raises valid points.
Oh yeah, they are all absolutely entirely fair. And I actually think that that's a fair point to make about Gilligan, particularly when he's writing these sort of episodes. Gilligan is very uninterested, generally speaking, about the mechanics of the paranormal stuff with which he's working. And then we point about, like, Pusher is the great example, where it's like, it's his voice. Until he can just write FBI on a piece of paper, or pass on a piece of paper, and suddenly that's how it works, because that's what the plot needs. But even later on in, say, Hungry, for example, where it's never quite explained how the central character of that episode came to be, how he could have been functioning as a human being for as long as he was. It's just like, this is the premise, and sort of go with it. And, like, I think I accept that a bit more than Marlene, because I'm kind of more interested in the thematic stuff. It is an absolutely fair complaint about, like, the show, Gilligan's writing in general, and I think a direction that the show sort of took later on as well, where it became less interested in plausible scientific explanation, or even the mechanics of its paranormal phenomenon. Like we pointed out again, the fact that the fourth season's around the last time that you get Scully offering these sorts of attempts at explanations, because they get so absurd, so heightened. But yeah, that's a very, very valid point, a very well argued point as well. I think Marlene touched on a lot of really good stuff there, and I would agree with a huge amount of it. I agree probably most of it, if not all of it. I would just maybe rate the episode higher because I sort of place the emphasis slightly different in how I appraise it. But yeah, it's entirely valid and entirely fair. I would go with that.
Yeah, let us know, Marlene, what you would rate the episode out of 10. Because I mean, I think 10 out of 10s can be a bit kind of simplistic and so on, but I'm just kind of interested in exactly how fond or otherwise you are of this episode, I guess. Yeah, so let us know. Maura Jaeger said, I love this episode. It's incredibly suspenseful, and I find Schnauz to be one of the most terrifying monsters in the entire run. It's no doubt a testament to the actor's excellent performance, but the character's torment and repressed rage is palpable. The only element of the episode that's irked me a little during recent viewings is how quickly Mulder found Scully. I know he's a first-rate profiler and incredibly intuitive, but that bit with the gravestones is a wee bit too convenient, even for him.
Yeah.
Let's see. Michael Little said, one of the most underrated episodes of the entire series. Unruhe is a fine example of why I watch the X-Files. It is a great Scully episode with a wonderful hook, and the scene in which Scully realises she is talking to the killer is brilliant. I will always contend that Gilligan's best work is his darker episodes, as much as I love his comedic genius. In many ways, I wish the show had gone more in this direction. Realistic horror with a dash of the paranormal. Rob Bowman directs this one like a man possessed. Terrifying. I like the point he makes about Gilligan's best work being in the darker stuff, because I would tend to agree, I think, because my favourite Gilligan episodes would be... I mean, Pusher's quite funny in its own way, but Pusher, Paper Hearts, Roadrunners I really like, and I really like Drive. I'm not as taken... I mean, it's all relative, because I love Bad Blood, but a lot of people would single out Bad Blood as the favourite episode in the entire series, for example. We mentioned Dreamland, he's one of the contributors to that, and I think it just speaks more to my taste, really. I'm more drawn to the kind of horrific stuff, I guess.
I'd be interested, because I would argue that you can't necessarily... I wouldn't be as comfortable separating the two as cleanly as that. Like, I'm going to be honest, I'm not a huge fan of Small Potatoes. I know a lot of people are. I really, really, really dislike Small Potatoes. But I adore Bad Blood. But I think that even in episodes like say, Pusher is a great sense of humor, as you pointed out. But even stuff like, say, when he does Breaking Bad later on, there's always that, like, darkly comedic edge to it. That's, like, it's incredibly dark, incredibly cynical, and incredibly bleak. But as you pointed out, like, that discussion he had at Millennium, like, he was talking about... When he's talking about how he needed to take a shower after he watched Millennium, he was talking about the lessons that he learned from Millennium. And the lesson that he learned from watching Millennium was that, and I feel like I've said Millennium enough times in this podcast, but the lesson that he learned from, like, feeling like he had to take a shower after watching an episode of Millennium was that you need to balance the darkness with a little bit of a sense of humor. And I feel like Gilligan works best when he sort of balances the two within one another. I think Pusher would be an example of that. I think Drive is a great example of that as well, because even though, like, it's not a comedic fun episode, the banter between Crump and Mulder is a large part of what makes it work, and a large part of that is down to the fact that Duchovny and obviously Cranston have this wonderful, not only sense of comedic timing, but also chemistry between them that's playful despite the horrific stakes that you're witnessing. And stuff like X-Cops as well would be another example there. So I think that I would be less ready to sort of, like, separate the idea of Gilligan being, like, dark, horrific, and being funny. I think that he can do both very, very well. Like, even Roadrunners, I think there's a very wry sense of humor at work about, like, the mechanics of the town, even amid, like, the grotesque, nightmare-inducing horror of it all.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a spectrum now, isn't there? Like, something like Tivernus would be something that's quite grim, for example. But you're right, I think the idea that there's kind of a clean break, and no, I think that's fair. I think, obviously, stuff like Pusher straddles the two camps. But let's see what Sarah Ford had to say. She said, I absolutely love this episode. It's one that I could never remember the name of when I'd look at the lists, so for a while I feel like I overlooked it when I'd make lists of my favourites. I have never been able to forget the bad guy hiding under a car with a hypodermic needle. I still glance beneath my car as I approach it, all because of this episode. I love the atmosphere created by the creepy old dentist equipment and the 50s twinkly logo for Twilight Sleep, and of course the creepy Polaroids. Just an all-around fantastic episode. And I guess it's kind of like we said towards the outset that, you know, the Polaroids themselves have become a nostalgic element, let alone the 50s logo and so on. So that's kind of something the episode's acquired over the years, I guess. Just a couple more. So Sarah Blair, I love this episode, but it isn't one I choose to watch often. It's really scary in a realistic way. Even after all these years, I still check under my car when I have to park in an unfamiliar or isolated place. It's a very well-written episode with great acting and directing all around. And finally, Cortlan Waters Bartley said, I really enjoyed a mix of paranormal and real-life aspects of how they catch schnauz. In some ways, it reminds me of Grotesque, where we get to explore the profiling part of Mulder's, and now Scully's, job. And yeah, I suppose we've touched on some of those similarities over the course of this discussion. But Darren, is there anything else you wanted to pick up on, or something you feel like we need to address before we go here?
No, I was actually just thinking about, like, because when I was watching the episode with Pruitt Taylor Vince, I was just thinking about how many X-Files cast members pop up in Identity, the movie from 2003. Because it also has a
John Cusack film.
That is indeed. It also has, like, Amanda Peet, and it also obviously has John Hawkes as well. So it was just sort of, because again, that was when the psycho element came up at the start. I was like, oh, motels, Americana, Pruitt Taylor Vince. This reminds me of something. I can't remember what, and it's like, boom, got it. So that was my very minor esoteric observation.
Yeah, I saw him recently. I think he appears in the second season of Stranger Things. Do you watch Stranger Things?
No, it's on the list of things that I should watch, but can't seem to find time to get around to. Haunted Hill is on that list as well, but I'm hoping to get to that before the end of the year. There's just so much, Carl. There's so much.
We're in the age of plenty, aren't we, when it comes to TV, I think. But all right, Darren, so before we go, let's hear about what you're up to online these days and your other podcasting ventures and so on. Yeah, what are you up to?
So I'm available online at all sorts of places. You can follow me on Twitter at Darren_Mooney. I write at the Movie Blog, which is my own little personal website where I write about film and television. I host another podcast called The 250, which is a show that takes a look at the IMDb's top 250 movies of all time. We do a new episodes there every Saturday at 6 p.m. BST. So we talk about one movie at a time, often with a guest. We're very pleased to have you on, Carl. You talked about Double Indemnity a little while ago, crossing over with the Movie Palace. So you can search that episode, but we'll be doing new episodes sort of weekly. And I also occasionally do the Scan-On podcast, which is an Irish sort of film critics collective, where every Thursday night we have a natter about the week in film news, Irish and international, the top 10, the new releases and stuff like that, and just sort of have a bit of a talk about film as it is at that moment in time. So yeah, you can find me online at any of those places. Oh, I also have a book out, which my publisher would yell at me if I didn't publicize. Christopher Nolan, A Critical Study of the Films, is available wherever good books are sold, and also where non-good books are sold. Wherever books are sold in general, we don't discriminate. But yeah, I've worked very, very hard on this. I'm very, very proud of it. And I'm kind of it's available if you want to order it. It is an academic textbook, so it is quite expensive. So don't feel like you have to. Don't feel obligated to. Any support that anybody can show to it will be much appreciated, and I really, really am thankful. I know that you guys have been great with the X-Files book, and it really, really means a lot to me, because like the success of that meant that I got to write this, and just thank you. That's like a reverse plug. It's like it's like don't buy this thing. It's very expensive. But it's more like, no, thank you very much. I'm well aware of the fact that people have been very generous and supportive of stuff, and just say thank you very much, guys.
Yeah, guys, well worth getting your hands on, whether you go to the library or whether you do buy a copy. I think it's well worth your time, is what I would say. And Darren mentioned the Movie Palace. So yeah, if you've enjoyed our references to Psycho, I mean, we haven't done Psycho on that podcast yet, but we've done other similarly dark stuff from that kind of time period. So it's generally covering the 1920s to the 1960s in American cinema. So that's my podcast, The Movie Palace. But in terms of the Xcast, you can find us in all the usual places. So Twitter at the X_cast. The Facebook group is X-Files Basement, the Xcast podcast fan group. That's all for this week. But until next time, always remember, trust no one.
The Xcast, an X-Files podcast, is produced and presented by Tony Black, alongside a dedicated group of podcasters and X-Files fans. You can find us on Twitter at the Xcast, and on Facebook if you type in the Xcast, or at our group, X-Files Basement, an Xcast podcast fan group, where you can continue the discussion about all things Mulder and Scully. If you want to support the Xcast further, you can now subscribe and become a patron of the show on Patreon. On Google, just type patreon.com/the Xcast. That's Patreon. You'll see all of our tiers, subscription options and perks, which include early access to episodes, bonus content such as commentaries on X-Files episodes, access to a patron chat zone, and even appearing on one of our patron roundtable discussions. We would appreciate any support you can give the show, so just go to patreon.com/the Xcast to find out more. Our title music is provided courtesy of Will A, who you can find on Twitter at IamWillAYE.